Hi, I'm Iya Gozum, and you're watching Rappler Talk. It's Ramon Magsaysay Award season once again. The award is considered Asia's premier prize and highest honor, and the region's equivalent of a Nobel Peace Prize. We are joined by Miriam Coronel-Ferrer, one of the recipients of the Ramon Magsaysay Award this year, recognized for her work in emphasizing the important role that women play in inclusive peace building. She is the first woman to head the government peace panel in negotiations with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front that led to the signing of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro in 2014. Hi, Miriam. Welcome to Rappler Talk.
Hi.
Uh, it would be stating the obvious to say that we live in a largely conflicted world and a divided Philippines. Maybe first let's define what does it mean then and now to be a female peace negotiator.
What does it mean? First of all, you're a peace negotiator and you happen to be a woman, which doesn't happen most of the time, as the field of mediation globally has been, like most institutions or processes, have been male dominated. And in that sense, you're a novelty. But the good thing is that there are more and more women coming up precisely because there's a campaign to really put women, to provide these opportunities for a lot more very capable women around the world to play leading roles. So, what does it mean? It means that you have to be a good negotiator and that you have to carry the banner for all women, for those who came ahead of you and those who will come after you, just to prove that point.
Is it alienating at times? Because you described it as feeling like a novelty. Is it alienating or
Alienating, maybe to a certain extent, if you sense rejection, you sense prejudice, but that's precisely the context that you're operating in, and your intention is to make it normal. I mean, it's novelty, but the idea is to not really make it novel, that it be accepted practice, that it becomes normal course of things, that men and women and men are actually engaged in this instance high level mediation processes. So that's sort of like what has been proven by our case in our negotiations with the more Islamic Liberation Front.
right? Why is it important that women are inside the rooms where formal peace deals are made?
Look, you never ask why it's important to have men inside the room, and yet when you talk about women participating in these processes, it's as if you have to justify it, right? So now that we're asked to justify it, let's come up with several reasons. Number one, how can it happen that you have 50% of the population, more or less, who are women, and they are not in a lot of these processes where the lives of everyone, men and women, are being decided? There's that kind of historical, how do you say, imbalance that has happened throughout the centuries. Second, while men and women can become good negotiators, they can have empathy for the issues that are being addressed. The the way women have been socialized, not the way they have been born, but the way they have been socialized, basically to perform nurturing roles, provides them with different perspectives and different concerns that might not be taken into account when you talk about, the hard stuff, so-called hard stuff pertaining to guns, weapons, and national security. So it's very important to have these perspectives coming in from the lived experiences of many women, and I'm not just talking about the women who are sitting there, but their connections with the women who are actually on the ground and suffering the consequences of the armed conflict. I think the perspective is very, very important because throughout the past decades, where more and more women have actually joined negotiations, you can see also that peace agreements have reflected more provisions related to issues that are very, very close to women and would have a direct impact on their lives.
Right. Actually, thank you for pointing that out that we actually don't ask why uh, peace tables are dominated by men. And that maybe that's something that we also need to take into account when framing how we frame our questions. Bakit nga ba tinatanong natin bakit importante
Mhm.
na merong mga babae when these agreements are made?
Well,
You, I said in, yeah,
that's why it's a trap question, you know why? And that's why if you look at the scholarly studies on women, peace, and security, a lot of researchers have focused on producing empirical data, how in fact it is very good to have women in the negotiations. And some of the empirical data that have come out is that women, if women were involved in negotiations, the process is more sustainable, comparing different cases, doing some quantitative as well as case studies. It's more sustainable, and because precisely there is greater ownership of the process, and also the provisions that have been managed to come in. But I think there are specific contributions that precisely can be made by women. But that's the whole idea of changing the whole narrative, and also changing that perspective, and making that perspective owned by everyone and not just by women, because it's very important that not only women are advancing these issues. It's very important that men are actually conscious about these things, and also women are conscious about these things, because sometimes they're not, um, and so that it gets into the picture. That's the kind of transformation that we're sort of like advancing.
mhm. You said in the previous interview that being a woman was first a stumbling block when negotiating with the MILF, but that had since eventually evolved into quote unquote a different dynamic. What
Mhm.
did you mean by that? What did it take to win the trust of the other party? And maybe hindi lang yung other party, even the government peace panel that's
Mhm.
dominated by men.
To win the trust, to win the dynamics, it took a long time, maraming kwento dyan, di ba?
Yeah.
In the beginning, there was that kind of resistance, and then eventually they took up the challenge of having to negotiate with a female chair. But the fact is, ang dami naming babae sa kwarto. So we had a lot of women from our secretariat, our lawyers, while they had no women on the other side. So that certainly changed dynamics, and that's what I mean. No, in any put a group of men in a room and they're all men, they will behave differently than if there were women inside the room. And that's something that can become a positive change in the dynamics. It can become negative, but it really depends on how people carry the ball, or play out the process. And in this instance, the whole notion of having women, a lot of women, young women, especially from our staff, come in, um, created that kind of felt need to have also women on the other side, and that's why eventually one or two women would actually join their team.
Did you feel it was a safer space having all these women around you during that process?
Well, I think it happened as a matter of course. Most of them were actually recruited by now Chief Justice Marvi Cleonen, and they were his students in law school at the time. So you can see that it was good on his part, perhaps because he's a feminist, to actually bring in a lot of women, and we carried over from there when I took over as chair in December 2012. But then we brought in also other women. So if you will find that in our technical working groups that we created, there are four of these. Three are actually led by women. And of course, the other side are virtually all men, except for two women distributed in the different teams. But they certainly performed extremely well, and that's how we ended up with the four annexes that you find now in the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro.
Right. Basically, to make the process more inclusive, you really need allies, no? Indeed, it's not just the work of women; it's also the work of men, right?
And
You've
so,
also said before.
let me give an example there. When our Islamic scholar, Professor Hamid Bara from MSU, actually spoke about women's rights at the time when we were still breaking through some of the provisions relating to gender. I felt that they were listening more to him than if we said the same thing 100 times again, 100
Oh,
times all
okay.
over. And also because he framed the issue of women's rights within the Islamic perspective, and that is
Mhm.
very important. I think this tells us a lot about how do we advance the cause of women. It You have to play it smart, you have to play it within, from where the other side is coming from. It's not something that you barge into a room and say, you have to believe in women's rights, and so on, right?
Yeah.
It's something that you have to process and to frame and create in terms of a discourse that's very much close to them. And in this case, the discourse is Islamic. The discourse is about the right to self-determination. And how do you put gender? How do you put gender in that kind of a framing that is very, very paramount in their own consciousness? And I think being able to do that paved the way precisely to open up more provisions. Because when we talk about inclusion of women and other marginalized groups, it's not just about participating in relation to the process. It's also about what outcomes you want to achieve. So, precisely the outcomes here will be reflected in the provisions that you will find in the peace agreement and eventually in the law.
Yeah, speaking of making outcomes possible, you've also said before that in peace negotiations, nothing is perfect. That there are things that we need to compromise on to be able to appease the parties involved. I'm curious though, did you set any non-negotiables when you headed the peace panel? Parang meron ka ba mga non-negotiables that you set? Did you set any, or was your perspective that no, maging flexible in the whole process?
Well, the parameters are our constitution, but the constitution can be read many different ways, and that's why uh, part of the guidelines we worked on under President Benigno Aquino the third is not only to um, promise what we can implement and implement what we promise, but also everything must fall within the framework of the flexibilities of the Constitution. And that's the parameters. And the Constitution, our Constitution, while much leaves to be desired, has very good components on public participation, civil society, women's rights, and of course, even acknowledging precisely the right to self determination of cultural communities, both in the case of the Cordillera in the north and the Bangsamoro in the south.
Right. You've been a key player from the inside, and now you have considerable time and distance to be able to judge the peace process now from a different and unique standpoint. Are you happy with the progress? Do you remain optimistic of what could happen?
If you look at it from global experience, where most peace agreements break down only after a few years, um, after 5 years, almost half have just gone awry. Some have ended up much shorter. The resumption of fighting after signing an accord, and it is in that sense that we still have something to be proud about our peace process. That it has withstood two turnovers of presidents, from President Aquino to President Duterte, and now current President Marcos, and that while it has been a very, very slow process, some processes have been faster. For example, in Aceh, they passed the law within, in a few months, 6 months, 4 months, 6 months after signing the agreement, they had the new law. In our case, it took 4 years, 4 years to actually pass a law because of the circumstances and turnover in government. But in any case, the law has been passed, the plebiscite has been held. You now have a transition government. The ceasefire is holding. There are a lot of issues. There are still violence, but that kind of the primary conflict, armed conflict, the vertical conflict between the state and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which is the largest largest, most organized armed group in the country, or at least before, until now, in a way, although they are no longer fighting, that has been achieved. And while there have been scalawags among them, which is the nature of all institutions or organizations, and that is not to rationalize, but to just to say that it does not has not destroyed the whole process. There has been no lost command coming out of the MILF. They have managed to, to hold their own fort together. We know that in 2012, for example, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, while we were still negotiating, broke away from the MILF. And so far, they have sustained that ever since they have sustained what are the core, the main body has been kept together under the leadership of Al-Hajj Ibrahim Murad. And that is something good, because any breakdown within the organization of the armed group creates a lot of problems. And on the part of government, I think it is trying its best, but there's still a lot to be done to be able to deliver its own commitments, especially on the matter of the normalization component, which has many components. Not only in relation to the decommissioning of weapons and combatants, and all the socioeconomic programs that's supposed to come with it, but there's also the element of transitional justice, and so on.
Is the slow moving process something you already expected when you were making the annexes?
Mhm. That's why, although I would say that we were too optimistic on our schedule, on our time frame. It was too much, because that was the goal, to finish everything by the end of the administration of President Aquino. But then,
Yeah.
you know that in 2015 we suffered this major mishap with the Mama Sapano incident, and that in that sense it sort of like really delayed the whole process. Um, but and then it took the took 2 years of the next president to actually pass the law, right? It could have been done earlier, but they fiddled with the shift to federalism and all that, and it sort of like delayed the whole process. But the thing is, it has continued, and the the challenges are still there, and the onus, or the responsibility to see it through, belongs to both the state and the and the more Islamic Liberation Front mainly.
Mhm. As you've said earlier, it hurdled turnovers of different to different administrations. What do you think are the follow-throughs that the new government, that the new under the Marcos administration, that they can do to ensure that uh, to fast track the process?
One is really to have an efficient bureaucracy
Mhm.
to support the transition, of especially in relation to what do you do with the 30,000 combatants who will be 30,000 or so combatants who will be demobilized.
40,000. Yeah.
Um, 40,000, I think that's the working number now. And what do you do with the communities that are supposed to be transformed into progressive communities? That requires a whole of government approach. How do you systematize it? At that time, we were working things out with the World Bank on a good database system that will sustain the monitoring of combatants who go through the process, just to ensure precisely there's that kind of sustained effort that will really create the whole transformation. But that's only the database. What about the delivery? You need good interagency coordination, because several segments of the bureaucracy will be involved here. You need to work with Congress. You need the budget to be able to do that. To what extent are all of these sort of like supervision and overall management, trying to bring this together with the full support of the top leadership, with full support of Congress. These are all important, and you can imagine that was really a big bulk of the work we were doing, trying to steer both the executive and the legislative branch, not to mention the judiciary, which just might scuttle the whole thing with a Supreme Court decision that will declare the agreement unconstitutional. But in any case, it's really that kind of a bureaucracy that is on top of the situation and very very clear about the goals. And I think we are not there yet.
Do you mean you do not see the Marcos administration having that level of political will to see this process through, to make the bureaucracy work for this peace process?
There is the intention, but the mechanics to be able to do it, precisely the kind of focus to bring all the elements in place. You have an agent, you have an office, and that's the OPAPRU. Then certainly it will have to work with the different agencies of government to be able to do this. And if there are different appreciation or different understanding of what need to be done, then and that's precisely because they were not involved in the process, right? They were coming in as people from outside, and all the nitty gritty details. Although a lot of people have been retained in the administrative level, and some of the committees that have been set up as part of the mechanism, so they have that historical memory. But that historical memory is useless if you don't have the 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 kind of resources, infrastructure, uh, bureaucratic infrastructure that will implement all of this. That's a big challenge, and maybe not to lose track of the goal. That what you want to achieve here is transformation. That it is not patronage that you want to prevail. I mean, how do you how let's we this is supposed to be, at least when we were there, this is a transformation process. It's not a return to the old ways, and it's setting the example how governance should be. So I think the use of patronage, the use of all of these other mechanisms, a lot of should not overtake the actual mechanisms and the integrity of the mechanisms to deliver the goods.
Do you think that's going to be a recurring problem in the future? Na as we turn over to the next administrations, those who did not work on it, mawawala or magdidwindle yung appreciation, yung historical and institutional memory of what happened. And thus, maapektuhan yung uh, will to see through this process.
I think that is quite normal in a lot of, especially presidential systems, presidential systems where there's really no continuity from one president to another. We saw that when President Erap Estrada came in, just doing away with the ceasefire agreement that was forged in 1997 by uh, under President Fidel V. Ramos. So you had the war, the major war, all-out war in 99, right? 99, 2000. That set back the whole process. In Colombia, when President Santos, the one who whose presidency was successfully negotiated the peace agreement with the FARC, FARC. The new president was from the opposition, and he just really did not have the intention of seeing through, but or did not have that kind of vision to see it through. But in any case, uh, let some of the elements go along, and so that's why you still have the process in place, but a lot still has to be implemented. So every time there's a leadership turnover, and most of the time the leadership in the armed group doesn't really change, right? They sort of carry over from the same generation. So it is in that sense that they have this, how do you say, sense of ownership of the past, um, which of course is perhaps must be respected, but at the same time there are new considerations for a new administration. So there's always that quid pro quo. When you implement, you're actually still negotiating, but the thing is that you negotiate in good faith, and you negotiate with the backing of the whole government, so that the whole government will deliver and do it the right way, not
Right.
through some other willing and dealing mechanisms.
Right. So moving on to a slightly different but related topic, do you think it would be possible for peace talks to resume between the government and the Communist Party of the Philippines? Kasi parang Defense Secretary Gibot Eudoro recently said in an interview na he's not really keen on resuming the peace talks and even called it a subversion of the democratic process. What do you think about that?
The Well, I wouldn't agree that political negotiations is a subversion of the democratic process. It's in fact the more democratic way to go, but it's not like you can do it anytime and jump into it anytime and expect good results, right? And that's
Right.
precisely the kind of frustration that people have with regard to the CPP NPA government negotiations, that you have done it, tried to do it all this time. You've had one agreement, the Human Rights and International Humanitarian Agreement, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, and you never signed anything afterwards, uh, to really get you any closer to a final agreement. So that's part of the frustration, and we can understand precisely why there is frustration or little hope in a negotiated political process. But at the same time, uh, well, to uh, to use a cliche, all wars end at the negotiating table. So it's been
Mhm.
said, right? But it's easier said than done. And when to do it, how to do it. These are the key issues there. For me, what is important now is that each one have an honest assessment of what has happened in the past, what has created all these breakdowns in the past, and one of them definitely has to do with how uncivil each one talks to each other.
Right.
Um, and I mean, you're just looking at the surface, right? The civility between the parties, and if it's not there, how can you actually go beyond some of these very basic small talk and surface level conversations and go deep into the hard issues? So
Mhm.
there is that kind of internal assessment that will have to be done. In the case of government, it will have to really assess its own strategy. Specifically, does it really make sense to target those who are not holding weapons but are
Yeah.
advancing perhaps the same ideology? Or is it reproducing precisely the conditions that strengthened the CPP NPA before during martial law? So those strategies really have to be seriously reviewed. On the part of the New People's Army, Communist Party of the Philippines, they need an honest assessment of the wisdom of their strategy, a
Mhm.
Maoist strategy that grew out of the 1950s, 60s through
Yeah.
guerrilla warfare, when guerrilla warfare was largely successful against colonial struggle,
Mhm.
against colonialism.
Mhm.
In Vietnam, you had the Communist Party leading the anti-colonial war, eventually establishing the communist state, China, um, um, and um, and so on, right? At least in Southeast Asia, because perhaps that's probably the closest coming from World War II in our context, coming from Japanese occupation, which created opportunities for the successes of communist parties. And then you had the 1970s movements, guerrilla movements, most like in Latin America, in El Salvador, well, in Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and then those are the 70s 80s generation that was were able to reach a peace agreement in the
Mhm.
1990s.
Mhm.
The whole world has already changed in
Mhm.
the 21st century. The conditions perhaps for guerrilla struggle may no longer be the same
Yeah.
after going through our own processes. And now they have to look at other models. And one model that struck me is the model of the Basque separatists called
Mhm.
the ETA, which had an internal assessment, convened its members, and voted on the resolution to move from armed struggle to parliamentary struggle, which they did voluntarily without political negotiations. In
Mhm.
fact, the Spanish government rejected the whole process when they self decommissioned their own weapons and arms.
Mhm.
And instead, now they are members of parliament. So I think there's that kind of serious examination how far
Mhm.
this kind of guerrilla strategy could be carried over, and to
Mhm.
what extent is it gaining popular support. There are still recruits, I can tell you, precisely because of the dissatisfaction. We still have students from the University of the Philippines and other universities in the country that are
Mhm.
joining them and going to the mountains. But it's there are really other better, you really need to rethink the whole strategy
Mhm.
in that kind of a historical perspective and also within the global context.
Mhm. But maybe that would uh, take a long time since the government is uh, red tagging activists, they keep on red tagging activists. And looking back in history through the years, I don't think the party is ready to rethink its Maoist tactics or the guerrilla warfare. So,
Yes,
do you think,
so
ma'am,
precisely.
it will still take
You
a
have,
long, long
you have the old
time?
guards dying, right?
Yeah.
John Season died last
Yeah.
year. You have some of them in jail. A lot of the front commanders in different areas, Mindanao, they've all passed away. So you have a new generation, which might turn out to be more radical, more, how do you say, oriented towards warfare
Mhm.
than the political process. But you still have a core of people who have been part of the open mass movement for the longest time, and I think they are the most influential in precisely generating this internal discourse within the party, the Communist Party of the Philippines.
But now that the old guard is passing and actually being murdered, no, it does create a low morale environment for the new generation. And my next question is kind of related to that, no. How does a peace deal make up for decades of historical injustices and violence? How does it serve justice to murdered and tortured rebels and revolutionaries, to the affected families and displaced communities?
The peace deal provides the mechanisms. It provides the program to be implemented for that, right? And precisely, a good peace deal addresses all of these historical injustices, but is also future oriented.
Yeah.
Because and in fact, addressing historical injustices have been the most difficult part to implement. It's been easier to create new political institutions as against really, being able to deal with each and every human rights violations that has happened. It's just very, very difficult. And so the real goal must be to prevent further human rights violations, because then you just accumulate all of these injustices, and then maybe other forms of reparations can happen as part of the peace agreement. Most peace agreements around the world today will now have these components about related to what is has been labeled as transitional justice. And we do have that in our peace agreement, but it's also a component that has not been significantly developed, in fact, largely unimplemented in the Bangsamoro Peace Agreement. So, so that's the intention precisely of going through a negotiated political settlement. But any political settlement requires compromises. It requires precisely a more future-oriented outlook rather than something that sort of like goes back to uh, to the past, to the point up to the point where the future cannot move.
Mhm.
It's important not to forget the past and to be able to do as much as one can about all of these things, but the past should not, but then you reach a counterproductive um, point when that past already not makes it possible to move to the future.
Mhm. Or ika nga nila, stalemate na. Anyway, ma'am, it would be easy to say that violence and conflicts are natural components of human existence, that they've been there since time immemorial. What kept you going despite what some would describe as a Sisyphean task?
I think basically, uh, so you're right. Conflict is part of human society. Even, I mean, it's there, right? You can have all kinds of conflicts, family conflicts, conflict with your friend, lovers' quarrels, and so on. But the whole thing is, how do you deal? The big question is, how do you deal with conflict? Do you use violence to resolve the conflict? Do you use indifference and just wish it goes away? Right? The thing is to take an active stance, not precisely to avoid the use of violence, and to advance other ways and means, social, political, cultural, economic ways and means, to be able to address the conflict. And I think that's the key message when we talk about conflict transformation or conflict resolution, peace building,
Mhm.
is that there are many issues connected to peace, but how do you solve them? So it's the how question and the where question. Where do you bring it? Do you bring it to a situation where some transformation is achieved, a better relationship is actually created,
Mhm.
and also eventually, something that can be sustained and create more, provide more justice to everyone concerned.
All right. Thank you, Miriam, and again, congratulations for being one of the recipients of the 2023 Ramon Magsaysay Awards. For more stories, follow Rappler on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Again, this is Iya Gozum. Thanks for tuning in.